Good afternoon. On behalf of the Nonprofit Management Program at Columbia School of Professional Studies, I'd like to welcome everyone joining us this afternoon for our conversation on philanthropy, climate change, and immigration. What is the impact of climate change on immigration, and what challenges and opportunities face the charitable sector? I'm Erwin De Leon, Chief Diversity Officer of SBS and a lecturer in the nonprofit management. So allow me to introduce our panelists. First is Nancy Yeoman. She is the author of On the Front Lines of the Climate Emergency, Where Immigrants Meet Climate Change, which was the inspiration for this panel. And this report has been published by Unbound Philanthropy. A link to this report will be sent out to all the participants in the chat. Our next panelist is Rini Chakraboti. She is the Senior Director of the Four Freedoms Fund at Neo Philanthropy, where she launched and spearheaded a national grant-making initiative on dramatically reducing enforcement, detention, deportation, and the criminalization of immigrants. Rini's career spans more than 2 decades fighting for and advancing the rights of immigrants, communities of color, and low-wage workers striving to achieve justice. And finally, we have, and I apologize for the clock behind us, but that will stop in a second. We have Dr. Steve Cohen. Steve Cohen is the School of Professional Studies Senior Vice Dean and Director of the Sustainability Management Program. Steve is also a professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and the director of its MPA program. In addition, he serves as director of Earth Institute's research program on sustainability policy and management. So thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I'd like to frame our conversation by reading a quote from Taryn Higashi, which is in the report. Taryn is the executive director of Unbound Philanthropy. And she writes, or her quote reads, "We're only going to find solutions to the grave challenges of this time if we see them as interconnected and solve them through partnering at the intersection." So we might not have all the answers by the end of the hour, but we can certainly start a conversation that hopefully will inspire action among our audience. So Nancy, I would like to start with you. So can you please tell us how your study on migration and climate change came about? And for those who might not have had the chance to read your report, what are some of your key findings?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I just want to say hello to everybody and thank you for having me and thank you for your interest in this topic. So as Erwin told you, I'm an advisor to Unbound Philanthropy. It may help to know a little bit more about Unbound. It's a small but very influential foundation that focuses exclusively on promoting immigration policy rooted in justice, and they work in the US and the UK. I hate to speak for Taryn, but I have a pretty good sense that it was seeing fierce storms, drought, flooding, all of the various signs of climate change that are all around us, that led her to ask the question, like, what is it that she and her colleagues needed to understand about climate change and how it's affecting migration and immigrants that would help them be better grant makers and more effective supporters of these already quite vulnerable communities that they support. So I'm now a consultant, but for many years, I worked at the Open Society Foundations, and most of you probably know it's George Soros's foundation, gives away about $1 billion a year, focusing on building vibrant and inclusive democracies. And I had worked on both climate change and immigration policy while I was at OSF. Though I had never worked on both of them at the same time. So it was a really, really interesting question because I really hadn't thought about this intersection. We started out thinking about what I imagine most of you are thinking about, which is Just like, what is the impact of climate change on migration? What are those impacts? How does that figure into a decision that a person might make, that they need to leave home? Where do they go? What kinds of systems support them along the way? Are climate migrants coming to the United States? What is the US doing? And what more could or should it be doing? So we read really widely, and we talked to dozens of experts, advocates, funders across a whole range of issues. We were thinking both about migration, but also climate and environmental justice, racial and economic justice. All of this, when we got started, was playing out against, the huge focus on racial justice in this country after George Floyd was killed. So that was kind of very present. And so I think we quickly came to see that while climate change is creating new migrants, and there's a lot to be said about that, of course, immigrant communities in the US are also experiencing climate change, and often it's in quite unique ways. So our findings are summarized in the report. I think it's been posted in the chat. I encourage everybody to take a look at that. The other thing I would add is that just last week, Unbound released a follow-up set of case studies that profile frontline organizations who are leading on really solving some of the climate challenges that arise at the local level, especially for immigrants. So what's in the report? We can get into this a little bit more later, but there's a few big takeaways that I would highlight. One, which I guess is kind of obvious, especially as we watch what's happening with the Ukrainians right now, the world is not ready for the displacement of massive numbers of people. You could think about the Syrian refugee crisis. You don't even have to think about climate change. And it's just really clear that we're not ready. And yet it's really, really important that we make plans. So another thing that I think when you think about some of those other situations of migration that's helpful here is to think about how migration is just like a natural reaction to crises of all different kinds. And so to use climate lingo, it's a kind of adaptation to climate change. And we would probably all be wise to try to think about it in that way. That's one, even without getting to climate change, that's just one idea I wanted to leave you with. The other thing is that, like, when you think about the way climate change is driving people to move, I think most of us have a really inaccurate idea of what that looks like. The vast majority of people do not leave their home country, even though climate migrants that want to cross borders get all of the attention. The vast majority stay within their own country. Although just a statistic about that, the World Bank estimates that by 2050, climate change will displace more than 140 million people within their home countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. That's a lot of people to try to deal with. And those are not the people who cross borders. For that small minority who cross borders, it turns out like there's this idea of climate refugees, but it's largely a metaphor. There's really no comprehensive international or national framework governing climate-related migration. There's no real definition for climate refugee or climate migrant. And then the other really big piece I mentioned a little bit earlier is that immigrant communities in the US are on the front lines of climate change. It's a largely immigrant workforce that does the dangerous and dirty work of cleaning up and rebuilding after climate disasters. They have very few protections. Many of them are undocumented, and for that reason, they and their families don't even qualify for the relief funds that are being used to do the cleanup that they're participating in. Another really interesting way to look at this is to think about agricultural workers and like what it takes for us to have tomatoes and strawberries on our tables year round. They are finding themselves forced to work harder and faster to keep food from rotting in extreme heat. And they themselves are subjected to increasingly hot and untenable working conditions and poor air quality because workplace standards have not kept up with changing climate conditions. So like those are the kinds of things that the report highlights. There's a lot more examples. And, what it really left us thinking about is that justice really needs to be at the center of our analyses and also the solutions. While climate change affects everyone, every single one of us, it really disproportionately harms Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And that damage is just compounded by our existing systems that make people vulnerable because of restrictive immigration policy, patriarchal systems and beliefs, structural racism, and just the economic stress and exploitation that we know is built into our systems. So I think I'll leave it there. I feel like I've spoken enough. We could hear from a few others. Happy to go into greater detail.
No, thank you, Nancy. And there's definitely a lot of detail and wonderful case studies that can be had just to show how all of these issues intersect. Thank you. I'd like to bring in to focus Rini. And if you can just start off, just tell us a little bit about your work at Philanthropy and the Four Freedoms Fund. And in particular, Nancy touched on this, but how have immigrants, from your experience, been affected by climate change?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Erwin, for organizing this session. It's a pleasure to be here. It's especially a pleasure to hear Nancy speak. So many of us have turned to that report as kind of at this point the Bible around talking about the intersection of climate and migrant justice. So just very briefly, Four Freedoms Fund is essentially a funder collaborative that was started back in 2003, really to strengthen the capacity and build the power of the immigrant justice movement, primarily at the state and local level. And over time, the pillars of our work have evolved to include strengthening state local advocacy and organizing infrastructure of the immigrant rights movement, increasing immigrant civic participation, building capacity to combat things like border militarization, enforcement, detention, and last but not least, in some ways helping to democratize the immigrant justice movement by supporting a number of emerging underrepresented communities. I will note that, last year we asked a number of our grantees. Last year we had over 135 organizations we supported, and more than a third actually reported that they work with and collaborate actively with climate and environmental justice organizations. And it was noteworthy because I will just say that even though quite a few of our grantees have been working at the intersection of climate and migrant justice, we as a funder are actually quite new to this work, though our interest really flows from longstanding priorities around supporting border communities, immigrant-led grassroots organizations, as well as some of the broader communications narrative work. And I'll also note that even though we're a US-based funder, our work too has increasingly shifted to focus on supporting refugees, asylees, and people on the move. I know you asked Erwin, just in our experience, right, as Four Freedoms Fund, how have immigrants been affected by climate change? And Nancy, of course, touched on a number of examples. The report profiles some incredible case studies. And I will just highlight very quickly, for starters, immigrants who are currently here in the US are here in part due to climate migration. This certainly includes Central Americans from Honduras, Guatemala, who ultimately fled hurricanes and storms to seek asylum in the US. but also after long-term drought made living in their home countries untenable, right? It also includes people from Haiti who, I think are widely considered, the country is widely considered to be extremely vulnerable to climate change, particularly in this part of the hemisphere. It also includes indigenous communities who often are invisible in conversations about migration, but also have been forced to flee their homelands in part due to droughts and climate change and or persecution for trying to protect their ancestral lands from extractive industries. So that's just kind of for starters. And then secondly, as Nancy mentioned, immigrants are also part of communities that are on the front lines of climate change. This includes a lot of immigrants who, again, as Nancy mentioned, are often brought in to help clean up and rebuild places like we saw in New Orleans after disastrous hurricanes and storm surges, without any of the labor or immigration protections. Also includes farm workers who are forced to work in extreme, sometimes deadly heat, or even as we saw most recently in California with the last round of wildfires, forced to work even though the entire valley is engulfed in smoke and you can see fires, beyond the hills. And last but not least, I'll just flag that, migration and climate migration are quickly becoming in many ways central to the culture wars that we're seeing in the US and a defining fault line globally. I don't think it's any accident, that more right-wing authoritarian governments have really weaponized migration and forced displacement to feed into just general fears, anxiety about national security. And you see that, of course, in the US, the blaring headlines around the border crisis or narratives about the caravans, mass exodus, or waves of migration. And, just being mindful that there's this kind of discourse and narrative around migrants being seen as the threat and the need to, quote, manage migration, instead of in many ways grappling what is the real threat, which of course is our rapidly warming world, or even focusing on some of the real antagonists, including fossil fuel companies, as well as some of the more authoritarian leaders who are exploiting these fears and xenophobia. So those are just some of the ways, and would love to talk more and discuss these in greater detail.
I'd be remiss, or maybe if I don't at least touch on this. As you well know, a lot of Ukrainian refugees are now going through Mexico, and it has been documented how they're treated differentially compared to other immigrants. So, I don't know because I realize it's too early to really ask what's the impact of the Ukrainian crisis and refugee flow on other migrant groups. But I wondered if, any of our panelists have any thoughts about that.
I would be happy to jump in, and I'm curious because, as you mentioned, Erwin, it is still very early, and just yesterday we were starting to hear about reports of some Ukrainian refugees arriving at the US border, and similar to so many other refugees and people seeking asylum, we're also facing detention, poor conditions, treatment, etc. So I do think it's still a little early to tell. At the same time, especially as we've seen in Europe, right? Millions of Ukrainian refugees, I would say absolutely deserve the warm welcome that they've been getting. And I think the point here is that so do the millions of other asylum seekers, right? Coming from the global South, who systematically and in some cases very brutally have been denied entry both into Europe as well as the US. And we saw that dramatically, of course, along the US border in Del Rio against Haitian migrants who were attacked by Border Patrol on horseback. But you even see it in Europe, right? Certainly with Syrians folks from Yemen, or even Black migrants who are trapped in Ukraine, right, while everybody else is allowed to cross. So, obviously this is complicated, but I will say, and I'm curious because I picked up on something Nancy said earlier, in my mind, this is an occasion to really point to the fact that this is exactly the kind of warm welcome and treatment that anyone seeking refuge deserves. And it also, to me, again, it's too early to tell, but it also shows that the global community can actually rise and meet the challenge. It is quite remarkable that the EU has been able to grant legal protection, healthcare, work permits, some kind of pathway for 4 million people, right? I think that's the latest statistics in what feels like, overnight, right? It's probably been about a month. And, a colleague was sharing with me, the statistic around Poland, which is roughly the size of New Mexico, right? They've received nearly 2.4 million people from Ukraine in just a month. That's in stark contrast to the rhetoric that we typically see when, oh no, there are 2,000 Central Americans coming to the US border, or even now with the lifting of this public health order, the alarms that are being raised about the potential of 10,000, maybe 15, 18,000 coming, I think per week. I have to check, it might be per day. But again, it's, this to me is a moment where should be a reminder that this is exactly what we need to do. And we can, in fact, rise to that challenge if we come together as a global community.
Good point. And at this, I really would like to bring in Steve here because Rini, you laid out two approaches, if you will, right? One that's more welcoming and people working together. But you did point out earlier the reality of politics here in the US, right? About the culture wars. So Steve, my question for you is how can, from a policy perspective, how can these intersecting issues of climate change and immigration be addressed? We'll just talk about even here in the US, right? At the national level, let's forget the global level. That's a totally different conversation in the US and maybe even in states at the state level.
I think it's important to understand this is not a new thing. First, in the United States, we had the Dust Bowl. That was an environmental catastrophe that resulted in tremendous mass migration from the Midwest to California in particular, which is an internal migration, but still the Okies were not well treated by the Californians. And, I'm old enough to remember John Kennedy becoming president, and he wrote a book called A Nation of Immigrants, talking about how important immigration was to the building of the country. Now, the Native Americans weren't that crazy about the idea, but that in fact was what built America. And again, this is not the first anti-immigrant wave we had, and it's also not the first environmentally induced migration that we've seen. I mean, the potato blight in Ireland is what brought the Kennedy family to America, which was another environmentally induced disaster. So this is not a new story. It's an old story. Here's the differences. First, you do have this incredibly polarized politics now, which has been put on steroids by the media environment we're in. I was talking, I don't know if it was to the faculty meeting or recently, when network news started in the 1950s, it was a public service and they lost money on it. CNN starts in June of 1980, and suddenly the media becomes a business where they make money, and they learned through Fox and MSNBC that you make more money if you narrowcast. And then of course you have websites and interest groups that live on dysfunction. They live on differences between people. And that's really one of the problems, that there's no place for consensus to go right now. Now, in terms of objective environmental conditions, first, we have 8 billion people on the planet. So more people are in the pathways of exposure to extreme weather. And because of climate change, we have more extreme weather. And so, we create an organization like FEMA, FEMA was created to deal with disasters, which were supposed to be emergencies. That's what it's called, an emergency management agency. Well, if an emergency happens every 10 days, it's no longer an emergency, it's a routine occurrence. And so response to not just climate disasters, but all emergencies, weather related or others, is one institutionalized response that we have to build up. And then the recovery function. And I think what we've learned is it's not just immigrants who are vulnerable, it's anybody without means. And so if you look at Katrina, all the wealthy people got out of town. And then they came back and they had the resources to rebuild, while some people had to live on the Superdome and have never been able to rebuild. And my colleague John Mutter wrote a book about the impact of Katrina on poor people and just objective indicators. And of course, immigrants are among that group of poor people. So I think, we see all of these things happening. And I think the policy response, first of all, is we need to institutionalize recovery, and we have to rebuild the ideology that immigration is good. It's funny because, we live in New York City. 40% of the people who live in New York City were born in other countries. Then if you add to that the student population, and before COVID, the tourist population, every other person you talk to, was from some other place. My grandparents came from Russia and Eastern Europe, and I wouldn't say they were willing migrants. They were chased out of the place. That's the way things work. And it wasn't like they were welcomed with open arms when they got to New York City. But eventually they made their way and they formed communities, which is still happening. I mean, it's not a smooth and easy process, but in New York City, we have 2 million people who speak Spanish as their first language. And my granddaughter just got into a school in Washington Heights where every other day the instruction will be in Spanish or in English. And I have to say that there are ways to have institutional responses to the fact that you have a diverse, heterogeneous population, and it's the glory of the city of New York. It's not a problem. Now, we do have people in the Midwest and the West and the South that are scared of this. Although what's interesting is it's often people who are one generation away from migration who start to work, who are most defensive, and that worries me. And I think that that's just manipulation and ideology gone wild, because I think we have to rebuild the ideology that, in fact, diversity and heterogeneity is a great strength. And I talk about it in economic terms in my class. We're in a brain-based economy. 80% of the GDP in America is service-based. So if I want to bring in the best, most talented people to my business, I want to be as inclusive as possible. And people from all over the world. I want people of whatever sexual preference they have. I want people with racial diversity, whatever. I'm just looking for the most talented, creative people. And if the government stops me from getting those people here because of ridiculous public policies, then I should be fighting it. So I think the allies here should be companies that are not always my favorite, but companies like Amazon and Google and Microsoft need to be, if you look at their workforce, if they don't have diversity, global diversity, they're in deep trouble. So my sense of all of this is that we're in a more complicated, crowded world, and we need to figure out different policy responses. The last thing I'd say is just on climate change. I'm one of the people who believes that the projections are wrong, that we are going to solve the problem, or at least make it less bad. Because the technological innovations that are starting and the transition that's underway will pick up steam, and that, if I were an investor, which I'm really not, the fossil fuel industry would be the last place I would put money right now.
Well, Steve, okay, but what about the philanthropic sector? What about foundations? Because you mentioned corporations, right? Clearly, it makes sense. They're large and all that.
Well, I think, it's interesting. I worked for a fellow named Al Steppen when he was at SEPA, and for George Soros, he started the Central European University. And part of what they were trying to do is build democratization in Eastern Europe. And I have to tell you, it wasn't easy, but what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, and we're seeing in these other states, is a direct result of those investments that were made at the end of the 20th century in building up a civic culture. So we have to now do that in the United States, I'm afraid.
Great. So Rini or Nancy, do you want to add a bit more before I open the questions to the audience around philanthropy? Like we know the complexity. I mean, the report lays that out wonderfully. So yeah, tell us, like, what is the role of philanthropy? Are they the catalyst? As an aside, the Social Stanford Innovation Review just came up with an article and the authors were very, like philanthropy will be the catalyst. Do you agree, disagree, or it's complicated?
I agree, disagree, and I think it's complicated. I guess what I would say is that I think there is a particular role for philanthropy in helping to solve particularly complicated problems. You could think of it as kind of risk, capital that can take bigger risks than governments can, especially given the political limitations that we've been alluding to. But that said, I mean, I often find that philanthropy isn't nearly as creative or innovative or risk-taking as it could be. So, one of my pieces of advice to philanthropies would be to be a little bit more open-minded, take a few more risks. I mean, it was a great privilege to work for, I think, one of the bigger risk takers in philanthropy, and those investments that Steve was just referring to are really, really, really important in terms of establishing a very different kind of sense about the role of a state in Southern and Eastern Europe. And that's, in many ways that is paying off now. But the other thing I would say about philanthropy, and this is a little bit of a critique, is philanthropy often works in what we call silos and has a harder time working across issues, across interest groups. And I think that is a real challenge for the kind of work that we're talking about here. I mean, obviously, climate change affects everything. So I would say that any program officer at any foundation anywhere ought to be asking the kind of questions that Unbound was asking about its own portfolio. What is the impact of climate change? What does that tell me about what I should be thinking about? And I think it's important to go an extra step, which is to then seek partnership with your colleagues who maybe work on some of these interrelated issues, but who, in many cases speak a different language, are beholden to a different set of stakeholders. Because I really think it's at that intersection. It's so great that that's the quote that you chose, Erwin, to launch this, to talk about how collaboration is really important, partnership, really, really kind of thinking beyond some of the conventional boundaries that hold us back. And I'll just say one last thing, which is reflective, I think, of the climate philanthropic community, but to a certain extent, the climate movement. If we continue to think about it pretty much as an environmental problem, we're really wearing blinders. And it was really striking to me when I worked on climate change at the Open Society Foundations, which is like one of the biggest, if not the biggest, human rights funder in the world, that we thought about it in that technocratic kind of way. And I think what we're all really being faced with now is the human implications. We can already see some of those human impacts. It's already happening. And it's just a really important moment to kind of pivot at least some of the attention from all of those amazing technologies that Steve was referring to really think about like all of the people and how to deploy those technologies in equitable and just ways, and to think about how we share the impacts across all peoples, countries, classes. And for us in the US, it really means stepping up in a much more powerful way than we have in terms of helping other people both adapt and build the kind of resilience that it's going to take to deal with whatever climate change is already baked in.
I have to say something that's a little bit out of, I don't know, it's not typically heard, but I think climate change is really one of the easier problems we have to solve. It's in a class of problems of technologically created problems for our planet, ranging from COVID-19 to biodiversity loss to other kinds of ecological problems that we don't understand nearly as well as climate change. That's why I'm reasonably confident that climate change can be solved, but these other issues are going to bite us even worse. And so that I think that it's a class of problems of introducing new technologies into our economy without using the precautionary principle to test it out first before we use it. And so we're basically living in we're exposed to lethal contamination on a regular basis and we don't know it. And then leading to your other issue, of course, the people who are poorest are least able to protect themselves against these insults. And that's and then at the same time, this anti-science urge, there are 1 billion people in the world smoking right now. 7.7 million people died last year from smoking related diseases. We've known since the 1950s that this stuff causes cancer, and we can't seem to convince people to stop doing it. So these are a class of problems that affect everybody, but of course, the poorest people the worst.
Rini, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, it is interesting and 100%, no surprise, agree with what Nancy just said. I mean, I do think funders have a role, and a big one is to be able to break out of our silos. If, for example, to the extent I'm pigeonholed as the immigration funder, then we have colleagues on climate justice, worker rights, et cetera, down the line, and understanding how that ultimately affects, the kind of work relationships and the movement building on the ground, right? To the extent that we're funding in silos, then we shouldn't be surprised that a lot of the work that the organizations we're supporting, as wonderful as it is, also tends to be very much siloed. So to the extent that we can take those risks, that we can join hands, right, and support a lot more of that cross-movement collaboration. And honestly, and this is something that I think is really hard for philanthropy to do, and public sector too, is really to be able to fund and support grassroots organizations and communities, right, who, to paraphrase the great Audre Lorde, do not live single issue lives, and in fact are the ones who are championing work and solutions at the intersections. That is something that I think is a unique role for philanthropy. Again, if philanthropy is prepared to rise to the challenge. The other thing I was just going to add, it's actually just piggybacking on something that Steve had said earlier about the policy solutions, and just thinking about this kind of interconnectedness, right, between, and parallels really between the climate change debate, immigration, et cetera. I mean, you see that embodied nowhere else but with the Department of Homeland Security, right? Steve, I know you mentioned FEMA. FEMA is part of that mega agency. The vast majority of resources are expended on detaining and deporting immigrants, as Homeland Security identifies migrants as the threat. So much so that the dollars that we spend on immigration enforcement completely dwarf all other law enforcement dollars combined. Now imagine if, we actually shifted and understood not migrants as the threat, but things like flooding, drought, wildfires, et cetera, and actually match that in terms of looking at that agency and shifting those resources to FEMA, to the Coast Guard, and to all the other agencies that are also embedded within the Department of Homeland Security that simply do not get the resources and attention that they deserve, because we are so preoccupied on cracking down on the border and sealing our border. I mean, that to me encapsulates so much of the paradox, but also how these two issues are interrelated, certainly from a policy perspective, narrative, and now more and more in this kind of more existential fight that I think we're facing in the US and globally around saving our multiracial democracy, right? So I think philanthropy hopefully has a role to play, but mostly it's to support many of these frontline groups and leaders.
At this point, I'd like to invite people tuning in to actually type in any questions they might have in the Q&A and actually address or read some questions that were sent ahead of time. So here's the first one. And in a way where you already touched on this, but and actually in the report, Nancy, you've given some wonderful examples, but someone wrote in, how can collaboration among diverse stakeholders be made more efficient and effective? And at what scale, right? I mean, I think in the report, it's easier at the local scale.
I would love to hear Rini talk about this because the Four Freedoms Fund does a lot of this in terms of bringing together different kinds of immigrant communities. The first thing I would say is that you've got to start with trust building. I have watched many campaigns kind of founder or fail to achieve their goals because they had very lofty goals that I think everybody could agree with, but the trust and relationship building really hadn't been invested in. Alignment in terms of the goals and how to get there. I think one thing that we're finding really we're finding a kind of dramatic contrast between the resources that are available, let's say, in the environmental community to work on climate change versus the resources that are available in the immigrant justice community. So, this again is a job of philanthropy to really identify those kinds of gaps and inequities and to try to fix them. So that's one of the outcomes so far of this report. For Freedoms Fund, Rini can talk about it, and Unbound are two of the earliest investors in a new project within the migrant justice movement to build capacity to work on climate justice and to do it, through this immigrant lens. So I think, those are a couple of themes. I mean, there's something really obvious, but I would just say, I think you can't force collaboration. And I think it's really important to, kind of reflect on what I just said, that funders really try to help create the conditions that allow collaboration to happen. Some of that is that funders themselves need to get better at collaborating with each other, but also thinking about how to create the conditions on the ground that would enable the groups who really do all the work to be able to collaborate with each other. But I think Rini is going to have a lot to add on this.
Yeah, I mean, I love your last point too, just to underscore it, Nancy, because I do think, and this is what we found in doing the survey of our grantees last year and looking at where they are gravitating towards in terms of some of this cross-movement work and collaboration, and frankly, being surprised as funders that in fact, we do have quite a few grantees in the immigrant justice movement, working closely with folks on climate justice, environmental activism, et cetera. I think we found something like over a third of our grantees are actively engaged. So to the extent that we really can support that collaboration, funding, I think, and funding equitably is unbelievably important, because nothing undermines trust than, giving money to the groups that are already well funded, and at the same time expecting a lot of the hard labor, frankly, of organizing, connecting with people, et cetera, to be done by grassroots leaders who aren't receiving a dime. So I think that's just, the reality of how funding can, of course, complicate things, and unfortunately, in worst case, actually undermine trust. And I'll also say that, there are so many organic examples of immigrant communities working hand in hand with low-income communities, BIPOC communities, et cetera, to, shut down local power plants, right? Make sure there are signs, et cetera, so people know, about the hazards and dangers in a community, as well as some of the incredible work Nancy included in the case studies and profiles of groups that are working together. We've funded for a long time work along the border, and this is just an example. And it is one of the groups mentioned in the Unbound report, Southern Border Communities Coalition. They're a coalition of border activists and groups along the 4 southern border states. And, it's interesting because, in the last couple of years, they have really deepened their relationships with the Sierra Club and a number of environmental groups. And I think that's hugely significant for so many reasons. It wasn't too long ago that, quite frankly, a number of those groups were taken over by folks who were kind of white supremacists, right? I think you all will remember the fights from a decade plus ago where the board had been taken over. They took a number of nativist stances, and there is still some of that in the ether, but what's happened in the last couple of years is really incredible to see border communities standing hand in hand with environmental activists, especially to not only protect lands, right, from walls and other things being built on them, but also understanding how that has an impact, right, on life, which is something that we all should value, right? So there's been understandably some pushback, and I think some of you might be familiar with, I think it was the Butterfly Sanctuary and some work that was profiled in the New York Times and the attacks that folks have received. But these are areas where not only we should be deepening our support for this type of collaboration, but also be ready to defend, right, with our dollars, some of the activism that's taking place, because in some cases people are doing this work in the US and facing a lot of threats, and we have to kind of we have to realize that and be ready to defend some of these activists as well.
Super. Steve, anything to add before I go to the next question? Okay. All right. So the next question is, what are some opportunities for undergraduate and high school students to engage with, support, and advance the works of sustainability, climate change, and immigration-focused organizations? And I'll extend this, Steve, because, with the Sustainability Management Program at Columbia, so, maybe you can speak to some of the work that's being done with your students.
Well, a lot of our students are gravitating toward these community-based organizations, at least as they, the more idealistic ones, I'd say. The less idealistic ones are going into corporate sustainability reporting and so forth. And we're hoping that they'll eventually donate enough money so that the other ones can actually work in the community-based organizations. But the point, I guess, about these kinds of students is that they're very idealistic and they're very mission driven. And we, in our curriculum, have increasingly emphasized environmental justice and this range of issues. And that murder in Minnesota was a galvanizing event for the university. I mean, we hired a group of people to help us with improving our DEI curriculum, and you see it in the classroom, and we've added a number of courses that didn't exist before. So that's increasing awareness among our student body. Now, our student body was pushing us. I mean, it's really increasing awareness more in the faculty. The students kind of were pushing the faculty, but I think at the same time, it's there, and the students, a number of students are involved in particularly community-based environmental justice organizations in New York. Here in Harlem, we have one called We Act, and we have a number of students. The woman who runs that, Peggy Shepard, has actually been involved in this since the 1980s, when she and David Dinkins and others tried to prevent the construction of a sewage treatment plant that somehow migrated up the west side from the boat basin to 150th Street. They lost the battle, the war, but they won a state park on top of it. So, the point is that our students are engaged this way. And I do think that, at Columbia, a third of our graduate students are from outside the United States. And so this is and the school, one of the schools, at SPS, it's a majority of students from outside the US. At the School of International and Public Affairs, it's a majority. And a large number of our faculty are either recent immigrants or still people from other parts of the world. So I guess the point is, we're in a kind of bubble here of globalization and international awareness and understanding. And our students are being challenged to work at the community level, but not just in the United States. At SEPA, we have a Master's of Public Administration and Development practice, and my colleague Glenn Denning sends his students all over the world to do the same kind of work. So that's still a strong current. And if anything, it's gotten stronger. I worried for a while it was disappearing, but the last 3 or 4 years, I think particularly as we come out of COVID, we're going to see more of this engagement. And I find it very encouraging to see, because I like it when the students push us in this direction, and even require that we set up a chief diversity officer for the School of Professional Studies, Erwin.
Oh, it's that. So I thank the students then.
We all thank them.
Nancy and Rini, what's your experience with the younger generation? Maybe even expand this question, right? Like, what would high schoolers or undergrads, what can they do? But do you see differences in terms, and yes, I did go there. Did you see the differences among generations?
Absolutely, right. I think in terms of what high school students, undergrads can do is, of course, to become involved, get involved with local community-based groups, do whatever you can, whatever your interest is, to kind of become engaged in your local community and work with local groups. And as for the generational differences, I don't think it's any accident that, I picked this up in the report as well, Nancy, right? And in talking to our grantees, that oftentimes where this kind of activism, energy, everything's coming from is, of course, from young people. One of the kind of powerhouses of the immigrant rights movement is a group called United We Dream, right? They're the largest youth-led, youth-based, primarily undocumented young people leading this incredible organization. They work hand in hand with groups like the Sunrise Movement. And, I was just talking to their phenomenal executive director the other day, who was sharing how, United We Dream, Sunrise Movement, Movement for Black Lives, they're all coming together to have a retreat soon. So, it's always the case, I think, young people are leading the way, and that's no different in this case as well.
Yes, I've definitely seen an understanding of intersectionality, not just of identities, but of social and all the issues, right? I honestly am in awe. I'm not saying that because I've got young students, but I see that a lot. Nancy, did you want to chime in? Because we have one more question from the audience.
Yeah, I'm just going to say something super quick because I really appreciate both of the previous answers. But I think Steve touched on something that's really important. I think you can do this work wherever you are. Whatever career path you choose, whatever level of government you feel most comfortable interacting with in your own home. I just think, with climate change all around us, it's inescapable. And there's like a huge amount that needs to get done. So I would encourage people just to ask the question, like, what can I do within whatever sphere you're in, starting maybe at the home level, then maybe at school, maybe beyond that to, like, even if it's just like a summer job, or if it's you're a graduate student and you're on your way, you're in business school and you're on your way to whatever your first job is out of business school. I just think this work is everywhere, both on the immigration set of issues as well as on the climate set of issues.
The last question, of course, is a huge one, and you all have a minute to respond or more. So do you think the problem is the allocation of world resources? It appears there are sufficient resources, but the resources are not allocated equitably. Steve?
I think the problem is extreme income inequality, which is saying the same thing. And I think it happens by nation, it happens within nations. And I think that, just in terms of pure economics, somebody's forgotten what Keynes taught everybody, which is that, if you have this kind of extreme inequality there, that's a prescription for economic disaster. So what you really want to do is make sure that the tax system results in resources. Last year during COVID, we actually decreased child poverty by a significant percent by giving people the earned income tax credit on a monthly basis. I mean, why isn't that part of the permanent law? I mean, it was a magnificent accomplishment. And I think we need to replicate that success everywhere. And I think if we do that, a lot of these other problems the people will have the means to help themselves, which is really what we want to see anyway.
Rini and Nancy?
Yeah, 100% agree. I'm going to mangle this quote, but it's something like Brian Stevenson talks about, right? About how the opposite of poverty is justice, right? And how much, wealth, et cetera, is a driver of inequality. It's not that we have lack of resources, it's definitely lack of imagination, political will, and fundamentally the kind of growing inequality. I mean, look, I live in California, and it's, and I have this conversation with my kid all the time where we're seeing in the last 5 to 10 years, our neighborhoods just completely being not just gentrified, but the explosion in the number of people who are unhoused. And it's coming at the exact same moment where there's tremendous infusion of wealth. You can't buy a house without spending $1.5 million in the same neighborhood where you go across the bridge. And so you see tons of people who are living, in mobile homes, cars, or under freeways. And that's not, again, because we have a lack of resources, right? In fact, it's just the exact opposite, right? So.
Yeah, and actually we have someone here who asked if they might add to your comment, Rini, that in their tracking of tens of thousands, they have demonstrative proof that the age group from 18 to 34 is more active. I think we can all agree on that. So we have literally or less than 2 minutes left. Nancy, I will, before I give the thanks to everyone, do you have a particular story or, that you want to highlight from the report?
I wish I'd thought about that ahead of time.
I should have asked.
Yes, I would say that maybe it's a slightly a personal story, which is that, I worked on climate change for 10 years at the Open Society Foundations and never thought about this intersection. And I care, and I've worked on all of these issues. So I guess maybe like what that leads me to want to suggest to others is to constantly be asking yourself questions, questioning your own assumptions, checking about how like the world around you might be shifting. So that's not the most uplifting or inspiring, but maybe it's inspiring people. And mainly it's just to like ask yourself questions, test your assumptions. talk to your colleagues, etc.
Yeah, well, you know, it's so funny. We could certainly go on, but we're at the 6 o'clock mark. And I do want to thank you personally, Nancy, Rini, and Steve, for joining us. Thank you so much. And many thanks to Liz Picard and Lonnie Ryan of the Nonprofit Management Program, to Vicky Klesek of the events team. And Lonnie, if you want to put up the social media slides, so people who want to follow the nonprofit management program in social media, you have the slide up. And for the participants who just belatedly put in their comments and questions, I apologize that we weren't able to answer it, but I hope that, you know, that this furthers conversation. You can reach out to all of us or what have you, but definitely please read the report. It's amazing. It's so much information, wonderful, wonderful work. So, and thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Right.
Thank you.
Good night.